It was a quiet evening, and the lights on the studio stage dimmed, leaving only the faint glow on Steve Harvey's face. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, a realization, a discovery that had shaken his very foundation of belief. The audience leaned forward, sensing that what he was about to say wasn't another punchline or story from his comedy days. It was something else. He looked up, his eyes soft yet burning with curiosity. "I was reading," he began, his tone low and careful, "about a man named Isa, what Muslims call Jesus." His words lingered in the air, carried by the weight of wonder. "And I realized they don't just respect him, they believe in his miracles, every single one." The studio fell silent. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade, as if the room itself was listening. He continued, his deep voice weaving through the shadows like a preacher at midnight. "They say Jesus, peace be upon him, spoke when he was just a baby in the cradle. That he said to the people, 'I am the servant of God. He gave me the book and made me a prophet.'" He paused. His fingers tapped the desk lightly, as though marking the rhythm of something divine. "Now tell me," he whispered, "what kind of baby speaks of God in prophecy before taking his first steps?" A murmur ran through the audience. It wasn't just disbelief, it was awe. Harvey leaned forward, his tone softening, almost trembling. "And they say that by God's permission, Jesus healed the blind and the leper. He touched those the world had already given up on, and gave them sight, gave them life." His voice cracked slightly, the emotion rising like a wave. "Man, when I read that, I had to close the book. I just sat there thinking, this ain't no ordinary man." As eyes drifted upward as if trying to see beyond the ceiling, beyond the stage lights, into something eternal. "But then," he said, lowering his voice to a whisper, "there was one story that hit me harder than any other." He took a deep breath. "They say Jesus took a lump of clay, shaped it like a bird, and then, by God's permission, and it became alive, it flew away." The way he said it made the words hang like incense in the air. You understand what that means? Life from dust. The audience was motionless. A few people in the front row clasped their hands, their eyes wide. Harvey's voice grew heavier, filled with both respect and confusion. "Now, I've been to church all my life," he said slowly. "I know the gospel stories, but nobody ever told me the Muslims believe that too. They don't see him as the Son of God, but they see him as a prophet, chosen, pure, untouched by sin, born of a virgin. They say Mary, peace be upon her, was chosen above all women." His tone shifted, darker now, filled with contemplation. "And you know what's strange?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. "In the Quran, there's a whole chapter named after Mary. A whole one. You tell me another religion that does that?" A long pause followed. The sound of breathing filled the room, deep, human, reverent. "So I kept reading," he said softly. "And I found that Muslims, they're waiting for Jesus too. Not as an idea, not as a symbol, as a real man. They believe he's going to return, that he'll descend from heaven near the end of time. He'll break the cross, kill the false Messiah, and establish justice once more." He swallowed hard, his voice nearly breaking. "And when I read that, I said to myself, man, we've been fighting all these years, arguing about differences, and yet, in the end, we're waiting for the same man." The lights flickered slightly. It felt like the room was breathing with him. "They believe," he continued, "that when Jesus comes back, he'll stand shoulder to shoulder with the Muslims in prayer. That he'll say, 'The call to prayer is yours. You lead.'" Harvey's eyes glistened now, the light reflecting off a tear that had escaped his control. "That's humility. That's power. That's love." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. I started thinking about all those miracles again. The healing, the mercy, the forgiveness, and I realized every one of them wasn't about showing power. It was about showing compassion. The voice that had once made millions laugh now spoke in a tone of trembling sincerity. You ever think about what kind of man walks on water, not to impress people, but to reach the ones who doubt, to show them that faith can make the impossible happen? The silence was heavy, the kind that wraps around you and refuses to let go. He went on, "They say Jesus never died on that cross, that God raised him up alive, and that he'll return when the world's lost its way. And maybe," he paused, "maybe that's the part we've all forgotten, that this world can still be saved if we listen to the ones who spoke the truth. His voice deepened, every word deliberate. When I read those words in the Quran, I didn't feel conflict. I felt peace. I felt like two worlds that had been kept apart for centuries suddenly reached out and shook hands. He smiled faintly, his eyes distant but alive. Maybe the miracles weren't just about what Jesus did back then. Maybe they're about what he can still do right here, right now, in the hearts that have gone cold. A faint hum played in the background. The sound of wind, perhaps, or a whisper. The kind of sound that fills the space between truth and faith. Steve's gaze dropped to the floor, then rose again slowly, his expression unreadable. You know, I used to think miracles were stories, he said, but maybe they're reminders. Reminders that God can bring light out of darkness, life out of dust, and peace out of chaos. The last light on the stage flickered, casting a soft halo around him. His voice lowered into a near whisper, each word trembling with conviction. Maybe that's the real miracle, that even now, after all the wars, the hate, the doubt, the name of Jesus still brings people to tears. Still unites hearts that never thought they could meet. He smiled softly, tired but peaceful. And maybe, he said, that's why the Muslims call him Ibn Maryam, Jesus, the son of Mary. Not to divide him from God, but to remind us where he came from purity, from light, from a mother's prayer. The music faded. The camera zoomed slowly on his face. A tear traced a path down his cheek as he whispered. When I read about Jesus in Islam, I didn't feel like I was reading about someone different. I felt like I was meeting him all over again. And as the lights dimmed completely, his voice lingered one last time in the darkness, calm, certain, filled with awe. Maybe the miracle is that he never left us. The silence that followed felt eternal, like the world itself was holding its breath. The camera stayed on Steve Harvey's face, a man caught between faith and discovery, between what he had always believed and what he was only beginning to understand. His eyes remained fixed on the floor for a long while, until finally he looked up. His voice, when it returned, was softer now, but carried an ache that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than words. You ever feel, he said slowly, like God's trying to tell you something, and you've been too loud to hear it? A long pause followed. You could hear the faint hum of the lights, the distant creak of a chair in the audience. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped tight as though holding something invisible together. After I read that last verse about Jesus, he continued, I couldn't sleep. Not that night, not the one after. Something about it kept whispering to me, like a voice that didn't belong to memory or imagination. Just truth. He rubbed his eyes, then laughed faintly. But it wasn't humor. It was disbelief mixed with fear. I went home that night, sat down in my study, and opened the Quran again. The words looked different this time. The air felt different. It was like the pages weren't paper anymore. They were mirrors, showing me the parts of myself I had ignored for too long. The lights dimmed again, the tone grew darker, and the soft hum of music filled the background, low, eerie, like the score of a memory unfolding. There's a verse, he said, that says, and we made the son of Mary and his mother a sign. He repeated the word like a prayer, not a symbol, not a story, a sign, something meant to wake us up. He looked straight into the camera now, his eyes raw and unguarded. I started to realize this wasn't just about religion, it was about recognition, about the truth that's been in front of us all along, hidden behind walls built by men. He stood up slowly, pacing the stage, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the silence. You ever wonder why the world fears unity? He asked. Why it's easier to divide people than to remind them of what they share? Because division feeds control. But unity wakes people up. His voice grew stronger now, filled with both pain and conviction. They told me all my life that Islam was different, that it was foreign, that it didn't belong in the same breath as Christianity. But then I find out they love Jesus too. They honor him. They follow his teachings. And suddenly I start asking, who built these walls? Who told us to stay apart when the truth has been the same all along? He paused, lowering his voice. And that's when it happened. The moment I'll never forget. He turned away from the camera as if seeing it again in his mind. It was around 3 a.m. I was sitting in that same room, reading about the return of Jesus. The prophecy says he'll come back in a time of great darkness, when truth will be buried under lies, when people will chase wealth and worship their desires. And it hit me, that's now. His voice trembled slightly. It felt like the pages were alive, like they were talking to me. I could almost hear the sound of a storm outside, even though the night was calm. I looked up, and I swear for a second it felt like someone else was there. The music deepened. Shadows flickered across his face. Not in a haunting way. He said, but in a way that made me realize I wasn't alone. That faith isn't something you find. It's something that finds you when you're finally quiet enough to listen. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. That night I started to pray, he said softly. Not the way I was taught, not rehearsed, not practiced, just talking. Like a man lost in the desert calling out for rain. His eyes glistened again. And I said, God, I don't know what's true anymore. But if you're out there, show me what's real. The music faded to a near whisper. And then he said, I opened the Quran again, and the first verse my eyes landed on said, indeed, this is the true story about Jesus, the son of Mary, the truth about which they dispute. The room seemed to shift. The audience could feel it, a sense that this wasn't a coincidence. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving it. I remember my hand shaking, he said quietly, because deep down I knew what that meant. It meant I had found what I didn't even know I was searching for. He sat down again, exhaling deeply. You know what's strange? He whispered. After that night, everything around me started to change. People started coming to me asking questions about faith, about Islam, about life after death. It was like the more I tried to stay silent, the more the truth kept finding ways to speak. His voice dropped lower. One day I met a man, a scholar. He didn't know me, didn't care who I was. We sat in a small cafe, just the two of us. He looked at me and said, brother, do you know what's the greatest miracle of Jesus? I smiled and said, walking on water. He shook his head. No, he said. His greatest miracle was that he never stopped pointing to God. He smiled faintly, his lips trembling. And that broke me, because I realized how many of us spend our whole lives pointing to ourselves. The camera zoomed closer. His voice softened, the tone drenched in melancholy. That man told me something I'll never forget. He said, if you really love Jesus, then love the truth he lived for. Follow the mercy he taught, because truth doesn't belong to one people. It belongs to the creator of all. The lights darkened again. His silhouette was barely visible now, framed against a dim golden glow. That conversation haunted me. He continued. It made me question everything, my fame, my comfort, my purpose. What good is success if your soul's still starving? He turned his gaze upward again, eyes distant. They say Jesus will come back when the world has lost its heart. Maybe that's why people are searching for meaning in everything. Money, fame, pleasure. Because deep down, we know something's missing, something sacred. His tone grew heavier, more desperate. I started to see signs everywhere. People arguing over religion, fighting over differences, while the poor cried for help and nobody listened. And I kept thinking, what if the real miracle is mercy? What if it's forgiveness? He paused, looking down, because that's what I saw in him. Whether it was in the Bible or the Quran, Jesus was mercy walking on earth. The sound of faint thunder rolled through the speakers as if the universe itself echoed his words. You know what scares me? He said, voice trembling, that one day he'll return and we won't recognize him. We'll be too busy judging, too busy hating, too busy proving ourselves right. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. They say when Jesus comes back, he won't come for a religion, he'll come for the truth. And that truth will belong to those whose hearts are humble. The background music shifted, now softer, almost sorrowful. There's a line in the Quran, he said, that says, and when God will ask Jesus, did you tell people to worship you? He will say, never. I only said what you commanded me, to worship you, my Lord and their Lord. He paused, his voice breaking. And when I read that, I cried, because that's humility. That's the voice of a man who didn't want glory. He just wanted people to find God. The camera drew closer still, until only his face filled the frame. His eyes glistened in the dim light. You see, he whispered, that's what hit me hardest. All my life, I thought greatness was about being seen. But Jesus, he showed me it's about disappearing, letting God shine through you. He closed his eyes for a long moment. And maybe that's why his story keeps returning to us, because we keep forgetting what he really came to teach. He opened them again, staring into the darkness ahead. That night, I prayed again, not for answers, just for peace. I said, Lord, if truth is one, then unite our hearts in it. Let me be among those who see it when others don't. The music swelled slightly, gentle aching filled with yearning. And then he said quietly, something strange happened again. He looked away, almost afraid to speak. I dreamed. It wasn't clear at first, just light, endless light. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt a presence. Calm, powerful, familiar. It wasn't words I heard, it was peace. The kind that silences every fear you've ever had. When I woke up, I had tears on my face. He exhaled. You can call it a dream, or maybe it was an answer. He looked back toward the camera, eyes heavy with meaning. After that, I started reading the Quran every morning, not as a comparison, but as a continuation, like two rivers meeting in one ocean. And the more I read, the more I felt the same presence, the same peace. He clasped his hands together tightly. One morning, I came across the verse where God says, indeed, the most honored of you in the sight of God is the one most righteous. And I realized it ain't about labels. It's about hearts. The music grew quieter, the tone almost like a heartbeat now. That's when I knew what faith really was. Not about where you're from or what you call yourself. It's about surrender. To the one who made you, he smiled faintly, though tears shone in his eyes. And maybe that's what Jesus' miracles were really about. Not power, not spectacle. The studio lights dimmed completely now, leaving only a halo of light around him. His voice softened to a whisper. The world keeps looking for miracles, but maybe the real miracle is believing again in goodness, in mercy, in God. He leaned forward, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. When I read about Jesus in Islam, I stopped seeing two faiths. I saw one truth spoken in different languages. I saw a message that had been scattered, waiting for us to piece it back together. A faint sound of rain began, soft, distant, like a cleansing rhythm. Maybe. He said slowly, we've spent too long worshiping words instead of understanding them. Too long defending our names instead of protecting our hearts. He lifted his head. And maybe that's why Jesus is still the bridge between worlds, between hearts, between heaven and earth. He exhaled deeply, closing his eyes again, because when the world finally breaks, when every false idol falls, maybe that's when he'll return. Not to start something new, but to finish what was always meant to be, the oneness of God. The music swelled, sorrowful, divine. He opened his eyes one last time, his face wet with tears. And when that day comes, he whispered, I pray I'm among those who recognize him, not by his name, but by the peace in his eyes. The final words came slowly, trembling, filled with gravity. Because if the Quran taught me anything, it's that truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard. He looked up, a faint, broken smile on his lips. And maybe, he said, his voice fading into the dark, the miracle isn't that Jesus lived, but that his light still does. The sound of rain grew louder, washing over everything, and then silence.